This is way too long. All right, folks, before we get to Paul Bremer, within the hour we learned that former actor Robin Williams, who committed suicide, died of asphyxia due to hanging. He hanged himself with a belt. He also had cuts on his left wrist, superficial cuts, according to the police chief who spoke to the media. He was also being treated for depression. There was no, well, he would not comment on whether or not a note, a suicide note was left. Toxicology reports, way too early for that. They won't be in for at least a week or two. So that's all they're releasing. They're saying there will be a further press conference where more questions could be asked and answered, but that's basically all he was saying, that it was death by hanging, asphyxiation by hanging with a belt, cuts on the wrists from a knife, superficial, and then all kinds of remarks about the condition of the body, how long the body had been there, etc. So a great tragedy. We'll have much more on this in this hour with Dr. Jeffrey Gardier. We'll also do a Gimme 5 tribute to Robin Williams in this hour. Later on, we'll have one of the Academy Award-winning producers, Gerald Moeller, who produced one of Robin Williams' movies back in 1991. All right, but the situation in Iraq, we're going to be joined by Paul Bremer, as mentioned, former presidential envoy to Iraq, former U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands, and former chairman of the National Commission on Terrorism. So who better to speak to about what the president has done on Iraq, has not done on Iraq, is doing on Iraq, and it gets confusing. First, let's all watch Barack Obama in his own words. Watch this.
In 2008, I promised we'd end the war in Iraq. We've ended it. I was able to keep my promise and end the war in Iraq. In 2008, I promised we would end the war in Iraq, and we've ended it. The war in Iraq is over. The war in Iraq is over from ending the war in Iraq. That's why I ended the war in Iraq. For the first time in 9 years, there are no Americans fighting in Iraq.
President, do you have any second thoughts about pulling all ground troops out of Iraq?
You know what I just find interesting is the degree to which this issue keeps on coming up, as if this was my decision.
All right, folks, we talked about this yesterday. Jennifer Rubin wrote about it yesterday. Joining us now, I'm very, very happy to say, is Paul Bremer, former presidential envoy to Iraq, former U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands, and former chairman of the National Commission on Terrorism. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to the show, sir.
Good to be with you.
Well, thank you very much. When you hear the president, I mean, you know, he ran on ending the war and pulling out all the troops. He claimed that time after time after time he did it. You just heard there. And then over the weekend when he's asked about it, he said, well, this wasn't my decision. This was the previous administration. They messed it up. What do you think when you hear that?
Well, I think history will be pretty clear that the decision not to have any troops there after January 1st, 2012, was a very serious strategic mistake that the president made. A lot of words from him aren't going to change history's judgment. I would add, I do think he deserves credit for getting back into the game in Iraq by his decision to use air power there. I don't think he's yet really faced the fact that what he's done so far is not adequate to meet the objectives he stated in Iraq. But he deserves credit for making what for him must have been a very tough decision.
Yeah, and when he came out and he talked about the purpose of these strikes, they were twofold. There was a humanitarian purpose, dropping those supplies to the people on the mountain, which, you know, when Bush dropped supplies to people in Afghanistan, they was roundly criticized, but that's a whole nother story. But I don't know how much, you know, the heat is pretty overwhelming there. I don't know how much longer people could stay on that mountain and facing the elements. But number two was, as I remember it and as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know, we're going to bomb these convoys of ISIS and hit them if they come near our installations, our people, our embassies. But this is all in the face of learning about the horrific slaughter of Christians and other minorities in Iraq. So was the stated purpose enough in your view?
No, you're right. He identified those two objectives on Thursday when he first made the announcement. Over the weekend, he made a very important third objective, which in his New York Times interview, he said, we will not allow the establishment of an Islamic caliphate in Iraq and Syria. Now, that's a strategic objective. I agree with that objective. I think that's true. I think we see what happens when terrorists take over a country in Afghanistan. So I think that is a third objective that he stated. Now, since then, last night in Martha's Vineyard, he walked that one back a bit by going back to the first two, talking about the humanitarian assistance, which no one can object to, and protecting our diplomats. Obviously, we're in favor of that.
Sure.
It's very curious. I'm having a hard time figuring out what the objective actually is. If you read what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, he said our objective is to defeat the Islamic terrorists, to defeat them. And I think that's the right objective. But then you have to have a policy that is consistent with that objective, which I don't think we have yet.
Yeah, no, it seems to be, as you just put, you need a scorecard to keep up with it. And that only does that not only embolden ISIS when they see all these conflicting, just as terrorists have been emboldened at other times from our lack of resolve?
Yes, of course. And contrary to what many people in the press are saying, I think a more vigorous effort to defeat ISIS, these terrorists, will also improve the likelihood of a broad, non-sectarian government in Baghdad. I mean, I think these two things are related. If the Sunni tribes see that we're serious about defeating these Islamic extremists, they're more likely to support what we're trying to do through the government in Baghdad. The same goes for the Kurds.
Yeah, and that's what the president has called for. So you're saying the harder the military action against ISIS, the greater the likelihood that he'll accomplish the political end of it.
Yes, though I think getting a broad, unified government in Baghdad is certainly important, and it certainly is a key vested interest of the United States. But our strategic interest is defeating the terrorists.
Right. What about al-Maliki? What role does he play anymore? How much of a problem will he be? I know that you certainly had many dealings with him over the years.
Well, he has clearly pursued a very heavily sectarian policy, particularly since we pulled our troops out, and that has not been helpful. And he is technically, under the Constitution, he's still acting prime minister until Mr. al-Abadi produces a new government. So technically he is still prime minister. Now, the good news this afternoon is that he's apparently given an order for the security forces not to get involved in the political dispute. That may be a first step towards his backing down a little bit. We'll see. Only time is going to tell.
Let me ask you about this back and forth between Hillary and the White House. Hillary saying that if we were more resolute in Syria, we wouldn't be in this mess that we're in now, and the White House shooting back that Hillary was on board with this policy right along. But also further, there was a meeting between Republicans and Democrats, top leaders, and the president reportedly before he left for vacation, where a couple of senators from both sides took the president to task on the Syrian issue, claiming again that if we were more resolute there, we wouldn't be here with ISIS. And he used not a nice word to say that that's not true. Do you believe that if we acted in Syria and were more proactive at that point, we wouldn't be here now in Iraq?
Absolutely. I've been publicly calling for more than 3 years for a more robust policy in Syria, and I don't think there's any question. I think history will be very clear on this. If we had taken efforts to support more moderate people in Syria, and I believe if we'd established a no-fly zone that would have prevented Assad from using these barrel bombs on his own civilians, we would have saved tens of thousands of lives in Syria and brought about what the president stated his goal was, which was to overthrow Assad. That was regime change in Syria was the stated goal of President Obama. So I don't think there's any question. I don't know what Mrs. Clinton said in the government. We'll all see those papers in due time. But certainly, if we had acted earlier in Syria, we would face a much less threatening problem today in Iraq.
Now, in your capacity as former chairman of the National Commission on Terrorism, you hear so much about the threat. I mean, everyone from people on the right to Dianne Feinstein talking about the very real threat of these ISIS terrorists coming here, coming to Europe, coming to the United States to do us harm. This is something that is very real. How do we combat these people with passports to get into our country who might be ISIS terrorists?
Well, it's going to be very hard because we're not sure which ones they are. It is exponentially more difficult because of the lack of action earlier in Syria. And the takeover, I mean, the president was right when he said we can't allow the establishment of an Islamic caliphate in Iraq. Iraq is not Afghanistan. Iraq is a major Arab country in the heart of the Middle East. It's not off in the mountains somewhere like Afghanistan. And we saw when the Taliban took over Afghanistan and gave free rein to al-Qaeda, we saw the damage that a terrorist group can do if it has a safe homeland. And those are the stakes in Iraq. That's why, as I say, I agree with the president's statement. I agree with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that our policy has to be to defeat these extremists, not just to set them back, not just to slow them down, but to defeat them.
And if we do, very briefly, we have less than a minute, the future of Iraq, it's gone as we know it, correct? I mean, the best we could hope for is what, three countries?
No, I don't think so. I don't go that far yet. It's possible. It depends a bit on what al-Maliki does over the next few weeks. I don't accept the breakup. And people who promote the breakup of Iraq have forgotten an important thing. Breaking Iraq into three parts gives the Arab Sunnis nothing. They get a bunch of desert. That is not going to be a stable solution to the problem of Iraq. It never was, and it won't be.
All right. Mr. Ambassador, I hope you'll come back. Great talking to you, sir. I love your insight, and thank you very much.
Nice to be with you.
Paul
Bye-bye.
Bremer, ladies and gentlemen, former presidential envoy to Iraq, of course, and former U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. Very, very interesting. We'll talk about this and more on the Malzberg panel. Up next on the Steve Malzberg Show. Don't go away.